Hello everyone, welcome to Best Recipes with Sharon. Often if we want to make our own hors d'oeuvres or appetizers, we'll look for those phyllo sheets that you can buy in the store. But here you can make your own homemade phyllo dough sheets. Phyllo dough is puff pastry's Greek cousin. They're both made from layers of dough, but phyllo dough doesn't puff when it bakes, it crisps. And it's important to get your dough really thin like this, so I'll show you how to do this. I'll also show you how to make spinach and feta filling, the kind that you'd see in twisters. And this can be used as a dip for fried pitas as well. The amounts in this recipe for the dough only makes a small amount, so you may want to double or triple it depending on how many you want to make. But if you've never done phyllo dough before, the amounts in this recipe will get you a starter kit enough to get used to how to work the dough. Alright, so let's do this. Start with 2/3 of a cup of all-purpose flour and put that in a large mixing bowl. Then add 1/3 of a cup of SEMOLINA flour and 2½ teaspoons of olive oil, 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and 1 teaspoon of white vinegar. And finally, approximately 1/3 of a cup of warm water. The temperature of this water needs to be around 43 degrees Celsius or 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And continue to add the water just a little bit at a time, and then mix it until the dough pulls away from the sides of the bowl and clings together nicely. Then turn your dough out onto a lightly floured work surface. And use just enough flour while you're kneading it to keep it from sticking to the work surface and to your hands. And continue to knead it until the dough is elastic and pliable like this. So it'll take 5 or 6 minutes of kneading. Then place it in a Ziploc bag and let it sit at room temperature on the counter and give it an hour or two. It's important to rest your dough for that long so that it will be easier to work with, and especially when you need to roll this dough so thin. And while you're waiting for that to rest, you can prepare your filling. Now that the dough has rested, divide your dough into smaller portions. Try and keep them even if you can, so that when you roll them out, you'll have the same size shapes. If you're working in small batches, you can work quick enough to get these done in a reasonable amount of time. You don't have to worry about your dough drying out. But if you have a larger batch going on and a lot of different pieces, you'll need to cover them with saran wrap to keep them from drying out while you're working with the rest of the dough. Now, depending on what you're making, what size or shape you want, you can roll it in a circle shape or in rectangles depending on what you're making. But you're going to use a cornstarch and flour mixture to put between each layer. And the ratio of that will be 1/4 cup of cornstarch to 1 tablespoon of flour. So you roll out several pieces of dough to be about the same shape and dust them with the cornstarch mixture and then stack them on top of each other. And I'm going to do about 3 or 4 layers. Then take that stack and roll it out until it's more than double in size. And you can turn it as you need to make the shape that you want it to be depending on what you're using it for. So rolling the layers together in a stack like this will allow you to get each layer more thin. And if you're doubling the recipe or doing larger amounts of dough and you have several different stacks, you can certainly cover the stack with saran wrap and put it in the fridge until you're ready to use it while you're finishing rolling out the other pieces. So here I'm just continuing on because I'm using a small amount of dough and I will be working with that dough all along anyway. And here I'm using a plastic ruler just to straighten it out a little bit and to make the size and shape a little bit more uniform. So if you want to do the twister, you'll leave it in a rectangle shape so that you can shape that better. And if you're wanting to do the smaller hors d'oeuvre, you might want to cut it in half again. And just trim the edges to make it look quite uniform, but it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect either. Now you'll peel apart each layer, and that's the reason for the cornstarch and flour between the layers before you roll it out the last time. And so that will keep it from sticking together. So as you can see, you'll get your several layers out of this again. These layers will be very thin, and you'll brush them with some olive oil now and stack them back together again. This is what's going to create the flaky layers that you get from this pastry. And each of the layers should be as thin as this, where it looks like you can almost see through it. Now onto the spinach and feta filling or dip. Like I said, you could be making this while you're waiting for your dough to rest. This is just one option that you can use the phyllo dough for. Place a 1/4 cup of ricotta cheese and a 1/2 cup of feta cheese in a large mixing bowl. Use your large spoon and stir it together. Then sprinkle in about a 1/4 teaspoon of dill weed. Then sprinkle it with about the same amounts of salt and pepper. Add 1 teaspoon of canola oil. This will help to bind it together. Then to thicken it up a little bit, add about a 1/2 tablespoon of semolina flour. And of course, stir that together a little bit. In a mid-sized frying pan, saute about a 1/4 cup of onions in a little bit of olive oil. Once they're slightly browned, add about 2 1/4 cups of fresh baby spinach. Stir that together, put a lid on top, steam the spinach until it shrinks down a little bit. And this will only take a couple of minutes. Then place it on a cutting board and chop it. And I chop it into fairly fine pieces. Then add that to your cheese mixture. And give it a brisk stir so that it mixes the spinach well with the cheeses. And this is the texture that I like to use for twisters or hors d'oeuvres. But if you want to make it into a bit of a dip, put it in the blender and blend it until it turns green. And then you'll have a great spinach dip for fried pitas, or for bread pieces, or nachos. Anyway, back to the task at hand. So I think I'll turn this piece of dough into a twister. Spoon some of the spinach and cheeses onto your dough like this, spread it out evenly, and then you roll it up jelly roll fashion. Take and stretch the dough out a little bit so that it's a bit thinner. You don't want it too thick through. And then you roll it up in itself until it looks like a spiral, or a twister if you will. Then I'll take another stack of dough and cut it into about 4-inch squares. Pull that apart like we did with the other one. Knead each layer with some oil and stack on top. And there is no solid rule on how many layers you want to do, but usually 3 or 4 works well. Then just place a spoonful of spinach and cheese filling right in the middle. Then take the dough and pull it up from the 4 corners. And once it's gathered in the middle like this, give it a little bit of a twist to secure it. You just want to make sure that most of the filling stays inside the pastry while it's being baked. And like I said before, you don't want to have them too thick through, so I usually measure about 3 inches across, 1 inch deep. It's more important that they're not thick through than it is how wide they are. Because I did make some larger ones as well, but they were mostly wider, not thicker. And if you find that you can't secure it and it won't stick to itself, add a little bit of oil and that'll help for it to seal. And I don't usually cook them up right away. I freeze them just like you would buy them in the store frozen. So place them in plastic wrap and in a plastic container and into the freezer. And when you're ready to bake them, we'll preheat the oven to 390 degrees. And remove them from the freezer and take the plastic wrap off of them, grease a dish and place them in the oven and put them on the middle rack and bake them until they're golden. And because they were put in the oven while they were still frozen, it will take probably 35 to 45 minutes. These should be nice and crispy on the outside and warm and comforting on the inside. Serve them fresh and hot out of the oven. This is a golden and crunchy, tasty pastry that can be used in an array of ways in your kitchen. It can be sweet, savory, or even meat-filled. So I hope you enjoyed this video on how to make your very own phyllo dough pastry, and also the recipe for the filling on the spinach and feta. So if you've enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up and comment in the comment section. Thanks so much for subscribing, and until next time, happy eating.